as a brief introduction, I am Nick Rossi. I am currently the Live Materials Senior Technician here at Ward Science. I come to you with a BS in Biology from St. John Fisher College, where I did a lot of different anatomy courses looking at chordates, just basic anatomy and physiology. So today we're actually going to look into rabbit versus cat dissections. As you may know, there's a little bit of trouble with cat availability, so we'll be teaching you how to use and transition to a rabbit specimen rather than a cat. So this is where I would like to answer the big question and reason why we are actually doing this today, and that is cat availability. Ward Science has been a science education supplies company for over 150 years, and a pivotal role of what we do here does involve preserved materials and dissecting specimens. Big reason for this is because we get to look at how the body works and uses several different organs to complete one common goal. It's a great way, for example, to look at, say, the digestive system and look at that NGSS standard goal of looking how all of these different organs work together to play a pivotal role and do, say, something such as digest food and break it down and pull and absorb those nutrients away from that. With that being said, I know a lot of you are probably used to using cat dissections in your high school or college labs. That is what I was used to as well when I was in school. However, cat availability has been shortened, and it has been hard to obtain them over the last few years or so. Mostly this is because of catch and release programs throughout the United States. It's a big reason why we are experiencing this cat shortage. I would like to emphasize, however, if you're not looking to transition or you don't feel like that transition's for you, we can still supply them. If you're looking and want to put in an order, we will take it. We will fill that order. However, it may take some time. So that's why we're looking at this webinar today, so that we can go over some differences, but mostly look at how similar rabbits and cats actually are, so that you may not have to really change your lab at all. That is the only answers and discussion I would like to talk about sourcing of material. However, if you do have any additional questions about sourcing, preserved materials in general, or any questions about your dissection, you can either reach out to me or, more notably, our preserved material category manager, Bobby Giroux. His email is below. Feel free to copy it down, or if you want a copy of the presentation later, I can send that to you. So moving on, Chris. What are we actually going to be talking about today? We're going to briefly look at NGSS standards, otherwise known as Next Generation Science Standards. They have become the main standards that we're looking to complete and look at when doing a dissection. We'll also look at specimen options. I've got a website item directory for you. Real easy, you can just plug in the item numbers and find the product that may be good for you. I'm also going to go over digital downloads and recommended accessories that you can use with your dissection specimen. We'll also look at dissection materials, ones I would consider that are required and ones recommended. Lastly, we'll briefly go over some safety notes. The main part of the presentation is we will be looking at cat and rabbit similarities and differences, whether it be musculature, internal anatomy, or skeletal structure. Lastly, I wrote up a very brief dissection plan. We will not be going over the entire dissection plan like I usually do in webinars. However, I have written one up for you. It's a very basic dissection plan you can use in order just to make a few simple cuts in order to open your specimen up and look at its internal anatomy. And then lastly, I will take any questions you may have for me. So NGSS standards, as I mentioned before, the Next Generation Science Standards are hoping you look at a system and its organs and how they play well together and basically work together to perform a common goal. As I mentioned earlier, a great way to look at this would be looking at respiration, most notably digestion. You can talk about how the liver, stomach, small and large intestine work together in order to break down food and then absorb nutrients from that food. And as I mentioned, dissection is a great way to look at this specific goal. Specimen options. If you'll look closely, the one in red is what I will be using today. I will be using a skin cat that was formalin preserved and that is actually double injected. So we've got a few different choices for you to look at. We've got rabbits that come pre-skinned. If you're working with someone who isn't very experienced with dissection, this is maybe a product for you. It will save you a little bit of time. I know when I was in college, we spent an entire first lab just skinning the cat and then moving on and talking about basic dissection methods. You can do that if you'd like, or if you wanted to skip that step and possibly an entire lab, you could get a rabbit or cat that is already skinned for you. You'll also look, and we have plain preserved or formaldehyde-free preserved. Obviously, one of them uses formalin. It's a little bit higher quality, but you do get the, I guess, flaws, you would say, when using a formalin specimen. Or you can go the other route and look at formaldehyde-free, which actually uses glutaraldehyde rather than formalin. We also have injections. You can look at plain preserved, single injected, double injected, or triple injected. The differences between those: plain preserved, obviously no latex injections. Single injected has red latex that's injected through the arteries. Double injected, red latex, but also blue latex, which is used in the veins. And then lastly, triple injected has a yellow latex that is injected through the intestinal mesentery, which makes it a little bit easier to see. If you ask me for my opinion, I would have loved a injected specimen when I was in college. It makes things a little bit easier to see, whether you're opening up the neck and trying to find the carotid artery or the jugular veins. It does really pop. The color is very easy to see. It makes your dissection experience a little bit easier. So if you are working with first timers, I would go double injected or triple injected specimens. If you have someone that's maybe a little bit more experienced and you don't want to look at those latex injections, you can feel free to go ahead and use the plain preserved. And then one last plug is, if you haven't heard about our Pure line, you should check it out. It's a line that is very, very high quality. However, you don't have to deal with the flaws of formalin preservation. This is because the formalin off-gassing is actually under 1 ppm, so you don't really have to deal with those formalin off-gassing. I'm sure you guys have dealt with it, the runny eyes and such. You're getting a much better product and a much better experience. So if that's something you're concerned about, you may want to look at our Pure line. Unfortunately, we do not have cats or rabbits currently in our Pure line, but it is something we are working on, so stay tuned, and it's something you may see in the next coming weeks or months. Chris, next slide. Specimen options. This is more talking about ways you can complement your dissection. Obviously, dissections are very hands-on, they're very physical, very visual. However, in my opinion, you can use complementary pieces to make your dissection a little bit better. One way is looking at skeletal structures. Right behind me here, I have a few examples. We do have rabbit and cat skeletons. So if you wanted to look at this and use this as a visual, you could. We offer these on our website. But most notably, I would like to plug our museum mounts. Unfortunately, I don't have one here for you today because the rabbit museum mounts are very, very large and quite heavy. However, they make a great reference and actually a great quizzing mechanism. These are great because it's a professionally dissected out rabbit, and with those, it contains several different latex injections, which help feature the arteries, the veins, and other notable organs. And with those, the very neat thing is it has different numbers that are gelled onto the specimen for veins, arteries, and major organs that we would deem important. On those numbers, if you flip the museum mount over, it actually has a key card displaying what all of those veins, arteries, organs are. So this does two things. It gives the student a great visual of what exactly they should be looking at and where they should be making their cuts. gives you a great idea of where things are located so that if they are doing a dissection for the first time, they know where, say, the dorsal aorta is located, where the carotid arteries and jugular veins are located. So it's a great way to give students a little heads up and a reference. And for teachers, it gives you a great quizzing mechanism because all you have to do is put up a piece of paper over that key card and you can quiz your students on what the numbers say they are. So basically just my recommendation, dissection is the great way to go. You can look into different products, but my favorite as a student would have been looking at museum mounts. Lastly, we also have digital downloads available. If you buy any of our products, you'll be given a link, which is actually right there above in the blue. This will bring you to an array of different products. We're currently putting up new things every single day. One most notably are our dissection guides. We are currently working on one to discuss similarities and differences between cats and rabbits. So this would be great if you're looking to make this transition with us. Everything is pretty much laid out there for you. They've got skeletal structure, musculature, whether you're looking at ventral or dorsal. They've got veins, arteries, circulatory system, big close-ups of the heart and say like the respiration system. And it gives you a great dissection plan of how to actually go ahead and find these. And also it's got quizzes on there you could use for your students as well. All of this free when you buy our products and available at the link above. So feel free to check that out if you decide to take any products from us. Required dissection materials, like I said before, we won't be doing an actual dissection today. However, I put up all of the materials that I would deem required if you're doing a rabbit dissection. Feel free to take a look at the data above. All of the numbers in parentheses are item numbers. You can plug those right into our website and it will bring you to what you're looking for. And you can also look at these recommended materials. Like I mentioned before, it's a picture of one of our museum mounts on the right there. It's an idea of what a key card would look like on the back, and then it calls out all of those arteries, veins, and organs. Obviously up top there are more dissection tools if you wanted to get a little bit fancier with your dissection lab. Feel free to take a look at those as well by using the item numbers on our website. And we've also got articulated rabbit skeleton that is shown behind me and also on the picture on the bottom right. And then lastly, we offer a disarticulated rabbit skeleton if you wanted to get a little bit more hands-on and play with the actual bones. So briefly going over safety notes. Obviously, when conducting a lab, you will want to look at any latex allergies if you are using latex gloves like I am today. Obviously, you'll want to wear gloves, wear an apron or a lab coat, and goggles at all time when performing these cuts. I would like to reiterate that scalpels are not necessary in this. If you're working with first-timers or someone with very little experience, I would recommend using scissors. They're much more forgiving when making cuts so that you're not going too deep and cutting major organs, veins, or arteries you may want to take a look at later. Obviously, if you do decide to use these, please cut away from you. And if you do receive some kind of cut, tell your students to notify you as soon as possible. Looking at specimen comparison overview, what we'll actually be looking at today is we're going to briefly look at ventral musculature and dorsal musculature. I'll point out a few that are different, though a majority of them are the same. And then a majority of what we're going to do today is look at the internal anatomy of a cat and a rabbit. Most notably, we will be looking at the small intestine, large intestine, and the cecum, because those are the three, I would say, major differences between the two when looking at internal anatomy. Obviously, I will go over the rest. We'll take a look at how similar the two actually are to each other. And then we'll do a quick dissection comparison, and I'll give you a brief summary of what we saw here today, and then I'll take any questions you may have. So first off, looking at ventral musculature comparison, these right off the bat just show you everything that you're looking at when you're looking at these specimens from a ventral view. These images are available as digital downloads on our website if you wanted to take a look at these further, or simply you can take this presentation and use it for what you'd like and take a quicker look into these. These are very, very similar. Looking a little bit more in depth, you can see there is some differences between the neck. You'll see the geniohyoid and the sternohyoid in the cat. It's a little bit more complex. However, other than that, they are very, very similar. So Chris, if you hit the next slide, you'll actually see how similar they are, and you see all the musculature that they share in common. So whether or not you are going into a more complex dissection and looking at musculature or not, this is an option for you because they are so similar. Going on to the next slide, you'll look at the dorsal musculature. These are also very, very similar. The cat is a little bit more complex when you're going down to the pelvic region. They do have a few separate muscles that are a little bit different. However, much like before, if you go to the next slide, the dorsal musculature is almost exactly the same. Obviously, I'm running through this a little bit quickly, but if you want to take a better look at these, obviously you can ask me for the presentation or look at that link that was provided earlier to take a better look into how exactly these are so similar. If you just go back to the previous slide, you can tell almost everything lines up other than a few right around the thigh region and the upper pectorals of the cat. So moving on, these are most likely more or less just pictures for you to look at as references. We'll go ahead and take a look at the internal anatomy of both. So obviously put your safety goggles on and we're going to get started here. Chris, if you want to hit our zoom in camera, perfect. And hopefully you guys can see this pretty well. In order to do this the best way possible, I'll start with one specimen and then go to the next. And then I'll see if I can get a camera view that works best so that I can actually look at both specimens at the same time. So Chris, can you zoom up at all where you are currently? No? Right there? All right, that'll work. So I'm basically just going to go straight up and down. Just to reiterate, this is a cat, and we'll take a look at the rabbit right after this, but I will point out major veins, arteries, organs that you would most likely be looking at in a dissection, and we'll then take a look at how similar or different you may think they are when looking at the rabbit. So I've got a pair of forceps here. I will point out some specific features for you. We've got the trachea here, this big piece. We've got the carotid arteries and the jugular vein in blue. As you can see, this is a double injected specimen, so these are very easy to see. This is something I'd highly recommend if you do have students that are either doing this for the very first time or may have a little lack in experience, just so they don't cut too deep and cut these materials out. Moving along, we get down to the heart, which is covered in pericardium. We've got the ribs opened up here for you, just to make this a little bit easier to see. You've got the lungs, obviously for respiration on either side, the left and the right. It's moving slightly farther down. We've got the liver, which takes up a majority of the internal anatomy. Within the lobes of the liver, if you pull out, you'll see the gallbladder, which is what I'm pointing to right now, that stores bile. The bile from the liver then is used to better digest food and help with food digestion. And then moving down a little bit further, from the liver you get the stomach, obviously where a majority of digestion takes place. Moving across from there, this is the part where you'll start to see the differences between the two. Here you've got the small intestine, which makes up a majority of the internal anatomy of the cat. This you will see is a little bit different on the rabbit. The main difference is the small intestine is quite a bit larger in the cat because it's a carnivore. It's going to be working really hard to break down that high calorie intake of a cat. It's going to work really hard to break down that food and absorb those nutrients. However, when you get to the large intestine, right here, it's a little bit smaller. That's because it's just going to be working on the reabsorption of water and then taking on any nutrients it's missed. Moving on here, these are all things you will see similar. That blue piece there, that is the vena cava. And next to that in the red, it's very easy to point out and see these when you have a double injected specimen, is the dorsal aorta. Stemming from those, if you move your way up, you will see the ureter, which is a little bit hard to see. That is connected to the kidney, which has a nice blue color. You can't miss it when doing a specimen. And then moving down, you'll get into the reproductive system. You've got the bladder on the end that contains the urine. And then farther down, you'll see this is a female cat, as you've got the vagina and the oviducts and so forth. And then one part I did miss is the spleen over here. Obviously the same as the rabbit. So just to reiterate, this is basically what you will see in the cat. Just to give a little foreshadowing, what you'll want to take a look at is the digestive system. We're looking at a carnivore versus a herbivore. So when looking at this, you will see the small intestine be much, much bigger in the cat. The large intestine be a little bit smaller. And then the cecum in the cat, which is quite small, you'll see in the rabbits quite a bit bigger. So we'll move on to that now. So this is the rabbit. Looks just about the same specimen. This is a skinned rabbit, double injected, so you should be seeing the most comparable specimen possible. Much like before, you've got the carotid arteries, the jugular vein, the esophagus, and the trachea up top, all just as you would in the cat. Moving your way down, you've got the heart covered in pericardium, the lungs on the side, a little bit smaller, but very similar. Diaphragm underneath. And then moving on, the liver. And then within the liver, you'll see the gallbladder. It's a little bit hard to see. It's more covered up in this specimen than usual. And then moving your way down, we get to the digestive system. As I mentioned before, this is where you're going to find some of the differences. Nothing striking, but still a little bit anatomy-wise different. Stomach, about the same size, same function as before, digesting of food. Moving your way down, I do have some T-pins holding these together. Take those out so you can get a better look. You will see the small intestine is quite large, but not as big as you would see in a cat. That is because a rabbit is a herbivore, so it's working on breaking down cellulose in those plants rather than really high calorie meals as in a possible rodent when you're looking at a cat. So if you push some of this intestinal mesentery aside, you will come to the cecum. It's a pouch right around the duodenum. It's very easy to see in the rabbit right here. So if you look for that kind of scaly structure, that is the cecum. You can follow it around. It's very, very large. Quite hard to find in the cat, but in the rabbit it is very present. You are seeing that in large structure because that is needed to break down cellulose in an herbivore. And you are obviously not getting that in a cat. So if you move on, you've got the large intestine as before. A little bit bigger in the rabbit as opposed to the cat. And then lastly, we'll take a look at the structures that are similar. Obviously, the big blue piece, you've got the vena cava, dorsal aorta in red right next to it. It's really nice because it's a double injected specimen, really clear to see. And then moving your way up, you've got the kidney sitting right next to the vena cava, and then the ureter coming down. That for the excretory system. And then moving your way down, you'll look at the reproductive system. You'll have the urinary bladder, and then whether or not your rabbit is a male or a female. So I'll try and put these together so you can try and see the differences here. I'll actually just kind of buddying them up and take out any T-pins, so I'll put them right next to each other. So basically what you're trying to see here is the main difference between the two. Like I have said countless times before, the main difference is the digestive system, most notably the cecum in both. Cat on the right here, you'll just see a lot of small intestine, large intestine quite small, and then the cecum very, very small. It's a very small pouch on the cat. However, when looking at the rabbit, you've got a very large cecum that follows a majority of the small intestine. Small intestine, a little bit smaller. Large intestine, obviously much bigger because you're trying to absorb all the nutrients from the cellulose.
Hey Nick, a question came in. Can you see the ileocecal valve in the pancreas in the rabbit?
Let's see. Let's see here. Unfortunately, it is very hard to see because the spleen is so small in the rabbit. So if everyone heard that question, the ileocecal valve from the rabbit, it is very small. Obviously, when you're looking at a cat, you're looking at a very large spleen, and it's very clear to see. However, it's a very good point. It is a little bit hard to see it in the rabbit because the spleen is so small. It's a good question.
What about the pancreas?
The pancreas? Yes, you can see the pancreas. A little bit harder to see when looking at the cat because it takes up a majority of the spleen here that's coming off the stomach right here. When looking at the rabbit, you can see it, a little bit harder to see, but it is here coming off the stomach. Coming off the stomach and attaching to the spleen. Okay? Do we have any other questions while I'm here? Okay, feel free to hit the next few slides, Chris. These are obviously just for your benefit. Take a look at the pictures if you'd like. Like I mentioned before, the big differences between these are you're more or less likely looking at a carnivore versus a herbivore. So if you hit the next slide, Chris. This is basically a summary of the two specimens, what exactly you're looking for, what would you be getting yourself into if you decided to go to the alternative rabbit because we have a majority of them in stock. The biggest differences, like I've said before, is the anatomical features you would see with a herbivore versus a carnivore. You will see some differences in the skull. Obviously, the cat being a carnivore, it's looking to hunt, it's looking to consume prey, so it's got those carnivorous teeth you'd be looking for. On the other hand, the rabbit, teeth a little bit, I would guess you'd say flat. Obviously, they're looking at eating plants, and you'll see a little bit difference in the eye structure because they're more for defensive purposes rather than offensive purposes. Like I said before, the digestive system is the big factor and differences between the two. Rabbits are the classic herbivore digestive system. They have a very long, large intestine and a huge cecum that works well at breaking down that cellulose. Cats a little bit different as they have the typical carnivorous digestive system. They possess a very small cecum, as you would expect, but quite a bit larger small intestine to work and aim at breaking down that high calorie intake meal that they've had. So moving on. This will give you a brief dissection plan if you wanted to copy this and use it for your students. Very basic, as I mentioned before. This is more or less 3 cuts. You'll be making 1 large cut, top to bottom, through the abdominal wall. If you're using a scalpel blade, make sure you don't go too deep. I would recommend using scissors for this, because if you go a little too deep, you will puncture most likely lungs and the heart. It sits very, very close to that rib cage area. And if you're working down below, you may cut the small and large intestine or other major organs. Lastly, the last 2 cuts, you'll work in the pectoral region, more or less near the clavicles or the subclavian arteries. You'll open that piece up, and then lastly, you'll work in the pelvic region. You'll just make a horizontal cut, which will open up 2 flaps, and that will present you with a majority of your internal anatomy if you're looking at the digestive system, excretory, respiratory, etc. I would like to reiterate that all materials I used today are available on our website at wardside.com. Feel free to email our Plus Us team, our tech support team, if you have any general questions. Without further ado, thank you very much for joining. Have a good day.